You know, between my Promise review and my One Good Thing project, I've been remarkably nice to Shira as of late.
Let's fix that, shall we?
Hello everyone, and welcome to What Do I Know, the show where I don't know how I ever thought that covering more of this show was a bad idea. Shira and the Princesses of Power is the gift that keeps on giving. It is by no means the worst show I've ever seen, but when it is bad, it is fascinating in how and why it's bad, and when it is good, it's fascinating in how and why it's good. And in case that cold opening didn't make it obvious, today's episode is an example of the former. Battle for Brightmoon is the final episode of the first season, and is meant to stand as the culmination of Adora's efforts to unite the princesses against the Horde. Unfortunately, it really doesn't succeed in delivering a satisfying payoff to that culmination. What's interesting though, is that it's not entirely the episode's fault. Some of the problems this episode suffers from are partially down to other episodes' inability to properly set up the payoffs that this episode attempts to deliver on. And in order to explain why these payoffs don't work, we need to understand what those setups are. So let's start from the top! Horde Cadet Adora defects from the evil Horde after learning that their motives for conquering Etheria are less than noble, and picks up a snazzy new sword that lets her transform into an 8-foot-tall super soldier. Upon joining up with the Kingdom of Brightmoon, she and her new friends embark on a quest to unite the other kingdoms against the Horde, reasoning that a unified people would stand more of a chance of beating back the invaders. They recruit Princesses Perfuma, Narcolepsy, Best Girl Entrapta, and Princess Frosta. Well, sorta. But after a mission to infiltrate the Fright Zone results in the apparent death of Entrapta, the other princesses take this as a sign that uniting was a bad idea, and all go their separate ways. Yeah, I'll come back to that. After the events of Promise, Adora ends up in a coma for reasons that I've never fully understood, and Bow and Glimmer have to be brought to the Crystal Castle by Swiftwind in order to wake her. Meanwhile, Entrapta,
who did not die,
has been helping the Horde with her research and has found a way to But in order to do that, they need to borrow an artifact from Shadow Weaver's sanctum called the Black Garnet, and Shadow Weaver isn't willing to share. Catra, Scorpia, and Entrapta get the go-ahead from Hordak, and Shadow Weaver attacks them while they're in the middle of setting up the experiment. They defeat her, and Scorpia drags Shadow Weaver off to a cell, where she stays for the majority of Season 2. Entrapta conducts her experiment, and wouldn't you know it, hacking the planet throws off Etheria's ecosystem, causing a massive storm that results in the Whispering Woods freezing over. By this point, Glimmer, Bow, and Swiftwind have succeeded in waking Adora up, and they all ride back to Brightmoon on Swiftwind, witnessing the destruction that Entrapta's experiment is causing on the rest of the planet. And that's where the episode proper picks up. Now, since much of this episode is given over to a lengthy fight scene, I figure it's only appropriate to bring in an expert on commenting on fight scenes. To that end, I've invited the ghost of my long-dead ancestor to help me with the commentary for this episode.
Ruin has come to our family.
Tell me about it. This is the Battle for Brightmoon. We open with Catra, Scorpia, and Entrapta expositing on what their experiment is doing to the planet.
With the Black Garnet functioning at 200% power, the precarious equilibrium that governs all of Etheria's natural functions has been thrown into complete chaos.
Nerd! Catra grows impatient with Entrapta's technobabble and asks her to dumb it down. Entrapta simplifies her explanation, essentially that amplifying the Black Garnet's power has sapped power from the other runestones, which is where the princesses get all their powers.
Wait. What was that you just said about making the other princesses less powerful?
Well, the other elemental princesses. I don't have a runestone, and Scorpia doesn't appear to have any connection to the Black Garnet anymore, if she ever did.
From this, Catra deduces that the other princesses' weakened state would make them far easier to conquer, and that if they destroyed the other runestones, they could permanently depower them and make the Horde's conquest of the planet absolute.
Get a strike team together. We're going to Brightmoon. We're going to take out Brightmoon's runestone. And with the Whispering Woods frozen over, there's nothing stopping us.
Now, credit where it's due. Understanding the stakes of a fight scene are essential for the audience's investment, and the way this episode sets those up could not be any clearer. Not to mention that they found a way to exposit those stakes without it being boring to listen to, which is no small feat. I just have one question. Why are you not attacking Plumeria first? You know, the kingdom that's located near the front lines of the war? I know Brightmoon has been set up to be the bigger threat, and losing it would probably be a greater loss for the princesses, but Plumeria is a lot closer, its people less experienced, their powers rely on plants and they actually live in the forest, so they're all too likely far more vulnerable, and its destruction could be used to lure out the other princesses into a trap, depriving them of the home field advantage. Not to mention that according to Entrapta's little demonstration, destroying the other runestones would make the Black Garnet, and by extension the Storm, more powerful, and presumably make the other runestones weaker. It's almost like having a kingdom comprised of peace-loving hippies be placed near the front lines of a war was an incredibly stupid and short-sighted bit of world building or something! I suppose the argument is supposed to be that Catra is still driven by her hate boner for Adora, and she's beelining straight towards her adopted home, but as far as she knows, Adora's lying dead in the Crystal Castle, so Catra should be under the impression that she and the Horde can take their sweet time conquering the other kingdoms. We're not even 3 minutes into this episode, and the show's own continuity is already biting it in the ass!
Carelessness will find no clemency in this place.
We cut over to Brightmoon, where Angela uses the Moonstone to set up a distress signal. Adora, Bow, and Glimmer spot the beacon and use it to figure out where they need to land.
The Moonstone is using all its power to counteract the growing cloud of darkness. It's taking nearly all my strength just to keep my connection with it.
Adora looks down on the woods and realizes that it freezing over means that Brightmoon is vulnerable to attack. They move to the war room and start planning their defenses.
Someone must have seen the distress beacon by now. Why hasn't anyone come?
The alliance is broken, and other princesses have their own kingdoms to protect.
Okay, this line is clearly supposed to drive home just how hopeless their situation is, but the episode has inadvertently shot itself in the foot by including it. I'll have to come back to this too, but rest assured, this line has helped doom the episode before it could really hit its stride. And to further drive home how hopeless their situation is, at that moment, someone does respond to the distress beacon. Spinnerella and Natasha.
Who?
Yeah, my thoughts exactly the first time I saw this. They were the only other princesses at the war meeting back in Flowers for She-Ra. Wouldn't blame you for forgetting about them. The show certainly did.
Spinnerella and Natasha! Thanks for coming, guys.
You still don't know what we do you?
Why did you ask him that? He gave you no reason to ask him that. Yeah, it's meant to be a callback to when he told Adora that he wasn't sure what they did back in Flowers for She-Ra, but he whispered that line to her, and they were across the table at the time. There's no way they heard him, so the dialogue doesn't flow naturally between "thanks for coming" and "you don't know what we do." Was there a line of dialogue missing from the script or something?
It's in the name. Net. Tassa? I toss nets, okay?
Yes, darling, you have beautiful nets.
Oh, now I get it. It was just a clumsy attempt to lead into a reveal that these two were a lesbian couple. I'm so glad the writers are spending their precious episode runtime to let us know what makes their background characters so incredibly unique and interesting. Also, did anyone else notice that Natasha got all uppity about Bow not knowing what they did, and then only proceeds to describe her powers and not Spinnerella's?
I don't want any of you risking yourselves. She-Ra can do this alone.
Adora, why the hell are you talking like you're the only fighter in the kingdom? Does Brightmoon not have a standing army? I thought they were the primary threat to the Horde's efforts to conquering the planet. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's specifically mentioned in the first episode that Glimmer has command of her own squad of troops, which we never see by the by, so there's absolutely no reason for Adora to assume that she has to fight an entire army herself.
What happened to you in that first one's temple?
I saw Catra in there. I thought I could get through to her. Light Hope said that I'd endanger my friends by coming back, and she was right. Everything that's happening now is my fault.
Wrong, 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 wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong.
Look, I know Adora's primary character flaw is that she tends to assume responsibility for anything and everything going wrong, even when she has no reason to, but this is a stretch even for her. Adora coming back to Brightmoon had nothing to do with Entrapta conducting her experiment with the Black Garnet. Yes, she probably wouldn't have been able to conduct said experiment if Catra hadn't given her that data crystal, but even if Adora knew about the data crystal that Catra took, and as far as I can tell, she didn't, Entrapta would have activated the Black Garnet regardless of whether or not Adora returned. In fact, Catra going to the Crystal Castle in the first place had nothing to do with Adora. So even if Adora never went to find a way to heal Glimmer, all of this still would have happened. Adora returning to Brightmoon and Catra running her experiment have no correlation with one another whatsoever.
You cannot learn a thing you think you know.
But Bow and Glimmer go in for a hug and ensure Adora that they've got this. They move to Glimmer's room and into what I can only assume is a walk-in closet where she's been stashing weapons. While Bow helps himself to Glimmer's arrows, Angela comes in and concedes that she can't stop her daughter from going into battle and gives Glimmer her father's staff. It's supposed to be a character moment for them, what with Angela insisting that Glimmer take a more passive approach in her efforts to resist the Horde, but it doesn't really hit home because the reason Angela has been so passive about the Horde doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Basically, the whole reason the Princess Alliance broke up in the first place was because her husband Micah was apparently killed during one of their battles, and the Alliance fell apart after that. And because of Micah's quote-unquote death, she started opposing the Horde by providing humanitarian aid to villages and kingdoms who came under the Horde's attack, rather than fighting them directly. Now, it makes sense that Angela would want to keep her daughter out of the fight, but that doesn't explain why she'd think passively opposing the Horde would be a permanent solution to all of the fighting. Not to mention that making her daughter directly involved with the war by making her a commander kind of contradicts Angela's desire to keep Glimmer away from the war. And this is just one example of the show not properly setting up its payoffs. This scene with Angela giving her daughter her father's staff would be an amazing scene if the writers had put more effort into the nuances of Angela's attitude towards the war and what role her daughter played in it. Plus, even ignoring the problems with Angela and Glimmer's relationship, giving Glimmer her father's staff still seems a bit redundant to me from a combat stance. I know that Glimmer's teleporting ability is still on the fritz from what Shadow Weaver did to her, but that's not the only magical ability she has.
Attack glitter! It's pretty, but it hurts!
There's a rumble from outside and Adora declares that the Horde has arrived. She transforms, and our trio head outside to see a dozen tanks pulling up to the opposite shore of the pond.
The smell of sulfur and gunpowder hangs in the air. The war machine is close.
Now here's where I think it's a good time to start talking about the fight scenes in this show. And in order to do that, we need to talk about the animation. The animation in the show is not good. I mean, it's not the worst I've seen, not by a long shot, but the kindest word I can use to describe it is unprofessional. I don't know if it was bad direction or the animators were just pressed for time or whatever, but a lot of movements and expressions in the show look kind of stiff or unnatural. And the show has a frequent problem of characters' facial expressions not matching with how their voice actors delivered their lines. And that's just the animation in regular scenes. Character movements and action scenes are a bit better, I suspect more time and budget was put into them, but they still tend to have a problem with the perspective. Like, look at how this fight scene between Adora and the Horde starts. One of the tanks fires a bolt of energy at the castle, and she jumps up to cut it in half. A cool shot in theory, but the perspective is all confused. The initial arc of the energy bolt looked like it's about to hit the Moonstone, but when Adora jumps up to intercept it, her trajectory makes it look like it's going to miss the Moonstone. In fact, it kind of looks like it's already flown past it. And in the shot where she cuts the bolt in half, it looks like the halves of energy are going into the water, yet in the next shot they impact onto the side of the cliff. And when Adora lands in the pond, it looks like she's jumped to the right of the castle, but in all the shots where she's jumping at the energy bolt, it looks like she's jumping up to the left. And when Adora jumps up on one of the tanks, it looks like the tank she's jumped up on is in the water, but that doesn't make any sense, because when she landed, she sent out a shockwave to push the tanks back, and they were all still on the shore at the time. I know, this seems like I'm nitpicking and none of this actually matters in the long run, but all of the mistakes I just described, that all happens within 16 seconds. 16 seconds of animation! That's how frequent these little inconsistencies are, and they quickly start adding up! Watching a fight scene in this show is like playing a Bethesda game. It'll look fine at first, but it becomes buggier and buggier the longer you look at it. It's especially noticeable when the Horde starts sending these little skiff thingies, and you can tell that all the animators did to make it look like they were moving was move a couple of JPEGs around to save time. And the number of skiffs that are approaching the castle changes with every shot!
More dust. More ashes. More disappointment.
The battle continues as Adora takes on the bots and tanks on the ground while Bow and Glimmer support on Swiftwind from above. At one point, Adora is forced to block a tank's shot by transforming her sword into a shield, which she can do, that was established earlier, and she gets momentarily distracted long enough for her to lose it.
Ringing ears. Blurred vision. The end approaches.
Oh, by the way, if you ever want to get drunk while watching this show, take a shot every time you hear this exchange.
Hey, Adora. Catra.
I swear those exact words are said every single time they meet.
Surprised to see me?
Not really.
I figured it wouldn't be that easy to get rid of you.
What?
What?
Okay, this does explain why Catra felt the need to beeline it straight for Brightmoon. If she suspected Adora might have survived their encounter in the Crystal Castle, it would make sense for her to go straight to Brightmoon as opposed to Plumeria the like. Hate boner and all that. However, this introduces an even bigger problem.
I figured it wouldn't be that easy to get rid of you.
If you thought there was a chance she'd survive your leaving her dangling over a pit, why did you leave her there in the first place instead of finishing her off? I didn't complain about it when I reviewed that episode because as much of a tired trope as it's become, leaving someone to die because it seems like there's no way for them to survive is perfectly reasonable. Especially in this case where there's clearly no way for Adora to climb back up. Catra being all, I'm not that surprised you survived, as opposed to being shocked and enraged at seeing her, just serves to make her look all the dumber in retrospect. I'd say this was the result of a miscommunication between two different writers writing two different episodes, which would at least be understandable, if not excusable, except that can't be the case here, because not only are both Promise and Battle for Brightmoon written by the same person, but that very same writer also happens to be the creator and executive producer for the show! Thanos! We get a brief cutaway over to Glimmer as she takes out one of the skiffs only to be cornered by Scorpia. But before Scorpia can put Glimmer out of my misery, Spinnerella flies in to save her.
Boom! Nets.
That net did literally nothing to help with the situation. You suck.
Remind yourself that overconfidence is a slow and insidious killer.
Also, I just realized, where are the Brightmoon guards? Even if Brightmoon doesn't have a standing army at their disposal, we know they, at the very least, have guards to help protect the place. We see them all the time in other episodes. Was it their day off or something? For crying out loud, even the royal guard from Friendship is Magic bothered to show up whenever there was a crisis.
I knew it. I'm surrounded by assholes.
We cut over to Catra and Adora as they continue to duel one another, and credit where it's due, their fight is a lot better than most of the rest of the battle. It's still not great, Catra and Adora are moving a bit like action figures in this exchange, but you can clearly tell that both combatants have distinct fighting styles. Adora fights like a juggernaut, relying more on her strength than anything else, and pursuing Catra relentlessly,
Barbaric rage and unrelenting savagery make for a powerful ally.
while Catra relies more on her speed and reflexes to avoid Adora's attacks, and gets hits in wherever she can.
Elusive, evasive, persistent. Righteous traits for a rogue.
It does create another plot hole though, making me wonder how Adora kept up with Catra all these years without She-Ra, since if Catra is able to keep up with She-Ra here, then it stands to reason that she'd outclass Adora in every way. But I suppose that can be reconciled as Catra being less careful before Adora became a Super Saiyan, and has since learned to be overly cautious. I especially love this exchange, where Catra manages to get the drop on Adora and gouge her back with her claws, only for Adora to counter by grabbing Catra and holding her in place while she checks her into the side of a cliff.
This isn't over!
Of course it's not over! It won't be over until Brightmoon is destroyed and the rebellion falls.
Alright, this is a good time to talk about something else that's been bothering me about this show. I've been dancing around it for the past few reviews, and it really needs to be said. Why does the show constantly refer to the Princess Alliance as a rebellion?
Recruit new princesses into the rebellion! And led the rebellion into a dangerous combat situation.
And now I expect you're going to ask me to join your rebellion. I would be honored to join your rebellion. With her on our side, the rebellion could control the seas.
You keep using the Horde. I don't think it means what you think it means.
The word rebel in this context implies that the Horde are the governing body over the kingdoms, and the princesses are rising up to fight back against their oppressive regime. Which is bullshit, because the Horde has no governmental control over the other kingdoms. They're an external force that is coming into the kingdoms and trying to take control away from them. The relationship between the Horde and the kingdoms isn't oppressor versus oppressed, it's invader versus defender.
Hello? Hello? Anybody home?
Adora eventually figures out where Catra is and throws a rock at her hiding place. She pins Catra to the wall and declares that Catra is lost, but then Catra reveals that the whole point of their little duel was to draw Adora away from the castle.
I think I just made a mistake.
Oh, and speaking of mistakes, this is a good time to correct a rather embarrassing one I made back in my Princess Prom review. In that episode, I took particular issue with the presence of an airship Catra and Scorpia used to escape the Kingdom of Snows, namely because it brought into question the idea that the Horde's war with the planet had been drawn out due to their inability to reach Brightmoon through the Whispering Woods. Access to aerial transportation would remove the Whispering Woods as an obstacle for the Horde and allow them to attack both Brightmoon and the other kingdoms directly. To illustrate how much of a problem this was, I cited the speed with which Brightmoon's dome shield broke during the battle for Brightmoon, arguing that if the Horde could penetrate Brightmoon's defenses that quickly, then a single bombing run would be enough to convince Brightmoon to surrender, if not level the kingdom entirely. And since Brightmoon is supposed to be the Horde's greatest obstacle in conquering the planet, then it would stand to reason that the other kingdoms would likewise not stand a chance. However, citing Brightmoon's dome shield destruction was a critical mistake on my part, since using that as an example ignores three crucial factors that played into the shield's destruction. For one thing, the shield in question doesn't actually break until about halfway through the battle, so it's hardly breaking quickly. For another, it takes about half a dozen tanks and at least a dozen robots constantly firing at the thing before it actually breaks. And finally, the Moonstone, and by extension the shield, is implied to have been weakened by the experiment Entrapta and Catra conducted last episode, meaning that, under better circumstances, it'd probably be able to withstand a hell of a lot more.
Congratulations, you're a failure.
Now, in my defense, the larger point that I was trying to make with that example still holds true. We clearly see Brightmoon take serious damage during the fight, And when you combine that with this bit with Angela holding the shield up, I'm led to believe that she needs to actively and consciously hold the shield in place for it to be effective, meaning that all it would take is one surprise visit from a Horde bomber while Angela's asleep or in the bathroom or whatever for it to be all over. Not to mention that the other kingdoms don't seem to have any form of aerial defense, except arguably the Kingdom of Snows, who have been neutral in the war up until now. And yeah, the princesses have Spinnerella and a few spellcasters from Mysticor to fight against airships, but they seem awfully limited in that capacity considering how rarely we actually see spellcasters partake in the war. Not to mention the opportunities the Horde would have to move troops and tanks and the like with this kind of technology, but nevertheless, the fact remains, I screwed up, and in recognition of that fact, I shall don a dunce cap for the remainder of this review. So as Adora runs back to Brightmoon, we cut to Glimmer noticing that her mom is completely exposed, and runs to help her, nice touch showing Glimmer still glitching by the by, before she's cut off by Scorpia. Yet another nail in the coffin in the idea that Natasa did anything useful in that scene earlier.
Send this one to journey elsewhere, for we have need of sterner stock.
One of the Horde bots sneaks up on Angela and knocks her out, which allows the storm to start coming in and damage the Moonstone. Glimmer manages to fight off Scorpia with the help of Swiftwind, and they ride up to the Moonstone to take out the bot going after Angela, but it's too late. Angela is out of the fight.
More blood soaks the soil, feeding the evil therein.
Meanwhile, Adora makes it back to the pond and starts looking for her shield, but she gets trapped by some Horde soldiers wielding charged whips. Not sure why the electric current isn't running through the pond water, but whatever. Catra comes down to gloat over Adora, before Spinnerella comes in and blows her and the Horde soldiers back. Congratulations, Natasa! You finally did something semi-useful in this fight!
A trifling victory, but a victory nonetheless.
We can still fix this, right? Please tell me we can fix this.
I'm sorry.
Damn! Okay, credit where it's due yet again. This is a fantastic Darkest Hour. I half expected Adora to devolve into some half-baked soliloquy about how this is all her fault again, but no, the writers realized that the moment could speak for itself. Bo asks her if they still have a chance, and she looks around at all the tanks, priming themselves to fire, and she just apologizes for failing. That is so much more powerful than any self-pitying ramble about how she wasn't strong enough. Probably be more impactful if it were Glimmer and Angela that went in for the hug instead of Spinnerella and Natasa, though.
As life ebbs, terrible vistas of emptiness reveal themselves.
Just as Catra's about to finish them off with the tanks, the runestone in Adora's sword starts glowing brighter, and some of the water droplets from the pond begin floating in the air. Yeah, it turns out the other princesses really had seen the distress beacon and have come to help. Even Frosta shows up, stopping Catra from destroying the Moonstone's tower and shoving the remaining Horde tanks away. And on top of all of that, the princesses working in unison seems to be increasing Adora's powers as She-Ra, and I gotta say, this really doesn't feel earned. Mostly because the writers made several missteps in setting up this payoff, primarily with that scene at the start of the Beacon episode where the Alliance initially breaks up. The group are all in shock that Entrapta quote-unquote died, and Narcolepsy claims that Entrapta's apparent death was the result of the princesses uniting in the first place, and she and Perfuma take her loss as a sign that joining forces is a bad idea.
Maybe there's a reason the Princess Alliance fell apart before. I don't want to be a part of it anymore.
Mermista's right. Being together makes us vulnerable.
That reasoning is completely asinine. You guys are fighting a war! Did you really think there would be no casualties? This is the equivalent of a child wanting to try out for sports for the first time, and then giving up on them because they scrape a knee or get a little winded or something. Never mind the fact that the reason for both Perfuma and Narcolepsy joining up in the first place isn't even mentioned in this scene at all. Perfuma joined the Alliance because she was inspired to action by Adora's selflessness, and Narcolepsy joined because she wanted to fight back against the Horde for attacking her kingdom, and she figured having She-Ra as an ally would be practical. Entrapta dying doesn't eliminate those motivations. This little third act breakup among the princesses is a contrivance in every sense of the word, and that's only half the problem. The other half of the problem is that the writers didn't properly frame the titular battle. I'm going to defer to Brandon Sanderson's philosophy in storytelling here. According to Sanderson, stories are comprised of promises, progress, and payoffs. The beginning of every story always sets up certain implicit promises with their audience. They then make progress with those promises, and then pay off those promises in satisfying ways. And there is an implicit promise in the first season's premise. Adora has defected from the Horde, and she's going to unite the other princesses, and there's going to be a big fight against the Horde once they're all united against them. Battle for Brightmoon is the payoff for that promise, but the progress towards that payoff isn't properly laid out. It's fairly standard for stories to have a third act breakdown where everything seems bleak, but the writers overplayed their hand by going all out, breaking the alliance completely and having Adora explicitly state that nobody's coming to save them. In doing so, the battle for Brightmoon is framed as just Adora, Bow, and Glimmer trying to defeat Catra's strike team, which leaves no room for the implicit promise that the princesses will come. Yes, we do know that the princesses are going to come to the rescue, but the reason we know that is because it's the cliche we've come to expect, not because the story has made an implicit promise that it would happen. What they should have done was have the scene where they break up be more open-ended. Reword Perfuma and Narcolepsy's dialogue so that they're wondering if uniting will make a difference, as opposed to thinking it's a bad idea outright, and have Glimmer be more encouraging, saying that while Entrapta's death was tragic, proper unification will eventually lead to success. Have Perfuma and Narcolepsy still be unsure, and end the scene there on an uncertain note. Then, instead of Adora insisting that the alliance is broken, switch it out with Glimmer declaring that they can withstand the Horde's assault, and that they just need to hold them off long enough for the other princesses to arrive, with maybe one or two characters, say Angela or the captain of the guard, wondering if they'll even try to come help. With these changes, you reframe the central conflict of the battle for Brightmoon, so that it's now less about whether or not they can defeat the Horde by themselves, and more about whether or not they can hold out long enough for help to arrive. That way, when the princesses do come to the rescue, it'll feel narratively earned because there was an implicit promise within the narrative that they would come. You want to know how I know it would feel more narratively earned that way? Because it's exactly what the Two Towers did in the Lord of the Rings trilogy!
Look to my coming. At first light on the 5th day. At dawn, look to the east. Go hit him! To the king!
But the frustration from this scene is far from over, as Adora holds her sword aloft and releases a blinding light that, I assume, resets all the moonstones. I say I assume because it's not exactly clear what's happening here, but whatever Adora does, it destroys the storm that the Black Garnet is creating, somehow, stops Entrapta's experiment, somehow, and repairs the damage that the Horde have inflicted on the moonstone, somehow. I should be furious about how much of a Deus Ex Machina this is. I mean, there was no setup for this at all. But frankly, I'm more infuriated by the fact that repairing the moonstone also somehow allows Angela, oh yeah, she woke up by the way, to heal Glimmer and restore her powers!
Boo! You disappoint me in every way possible!
Now, let me be clear. The problem with Glimmer getting her powers back is not the method by which it occurs. It's not even necessarily a bad creative decision, and it's certainly not because I think Glimmer deserves to suffer more for her behavior during Princess Prom. Although, given my track record, I wouldn't blame you for thinking that. No, the problem with giving Glimmer her powers back this early is that it closes off so many opportunities for far more engaging story beats later down the line. Say Glimmer doesn't get her powers back in this scene. Say the Moonstone can't fix Shadow Weaver's curse, or it only provides her with a brief power-up that allows her to overcome the curse temporarily. Imagine the potential for Glimmer's development there. In the next season, you could maybe have her try to learn to fight without teleporting, or maybe she's so dependent on it that she can no longer be relied upon in a fight and must learn to contribute to the group's success in other ways. How fascinating would it be to watch Glimmer face a personal obstacle like that, having relied on teleporting for so long? Hell, I'd argue it'd be a necessary point of development because it would help her grow past her more selfish and impulsive tendencies. In fact, giving Glimmer her powers back this early doesn't just close off potentially interesting opportunities for her development. Imagine what holding off Glimmer's recovery could do for other characters' development, namely Angela and Shadow Weaver. At the end of Season 2, Shadow Weaver finds a way to escape her imprisonment and makes her way to Brightmoon so that she can get Adora to heal her and allow her to defect from the Horde as well. When she initially arrives, Angela immediately has her locked up and refuses to let Adora see her, fearing that Shadow Weaver would attempt to hurt or manipulate Adora if she allowed them to meet. She then proceeds to interrogate Shadow Weaver, but Shadow Weaver clams up immediately, insisting that the only person she'll talk to is Adora. Adora eventually forces the issue and sneaks in to see Shadow Weaver anyway, but in a version of this show where Glimmer never got her powers back, Shadow Weaver would have a bargaining chip during this interrogation. Shadow Weaver could offer to fix what she did to Glimmer in exchange for time alone with Adora, and Angela, being Glimmer's mom, would be very tempted by that offer, essentially being forced to choose between her daughter's well-being or Adora's. Or, we could just give Glimmer her powers back now and completely forego all those potentially interesting story beats. That works too!
Your blade. It did not come deep enough.
The princesses attack, combining their powers to significant effect and start taking out the remaining tanks. Oh hey, Natasha actually did something useful again. What? I made fun of her for being useless before. It's only fair that I keep pointing out examples where she's helpful.
Masterfully executed.
The Alliance all start touching each other. Not like that! And with their powers combined, they perform a Care Bear stare and blast the remaining Horde forces away. The group all hug it out, celebrating their successful use of a technique that we will never ever see again. We then cut over to the Fright Zone where Catra, Scorpia, and Entrapta are meeting with Hordak, who claims that their experiment was a failure. Entrapta counters by declaring that the experiment has taught her more about First One's tech than ever before, and Catra points out that she's come closer to conquering Brightmoon than anyone else, and that the Whispering Woods are still frozen.
Etheria is ours for the taking.
And we end the episode, and the season, with Hordak declaring that Catra will have plenty of opportunities to prove herself as his second-in-command in the war to come.
Well, on a scale of 1 to 10, we give it a 3.
Oh, well, maybe it wasn't that good. Let's give it a 1.
You may have noticed that I've started making a point of not name-dropping anyone involved with the creative process while writing these reviews. Mostly I do this because I prefer to examine the work as its own separate entity, but another reason I do it is because, since many of my reviews are negative, I'd rather not be the impetus for any sort of harassment campaign if I can help it, and not naming anyone helps keep the creators separate from the work. I bring this up because while I was writing this review in particular, I took the liberty of looking up the show's executive producer, N.D. Stevenson, because I came under the impression that many of the show's mistakes were the result of an inexperienced writer, and I wanted to be sure before I accused anyone of lacking proper experience. Lucky I did too, because Stevenson does have plenty of other writing credits to her name, including DuckTales 2017, Rapunzel's Tangle Adventure, and Wander Over Yonder. But there's one thing that all of these other writing credits have in common. They don't have Stevenson listed as their executive producer. They just have her credited as writing 1 or 2 episodes overall. She-Ra and the Princesses of Power is the only show where Stevenson was directly involved with everything that was going on. I don't think the numerous problems with She-Ra are the result of a bad writer. It's more likely that Stevenson is more used to telling short-term stories where she has to work within set limitations, and she isn't used to being in charge of the bigger picture. That, or she wasn't given enough time to develop all of her story ideas, and was forced to work with the first draft of her story. Either explanation would make sense considering the state of the final product, and the state of battle for Brightmoon in particular. It has a decent enough start, a fantastic darkest hour, and the rivalry between Adora and Catra is as compelling as ever, retroactively making Catra an idiot notwithstanding. But the battle wasn't properly framed, the animation was either not given enough time or enough money, Adora magically fixing all the damage the Horde did comes out of nowhere, it gives Glimmer her powers back way too early in the game, and the show undermines the episode long before it ever started by having the Princess Alliance break instead of fracture. Also, I'm not entirely convinced that Hordak's decision to make Catra his second-in-command makes sense, but that's small potatoes compared to the other problems this episode has. To be perfectly frank, I think whether She-Ra would have been any better if Stevenson had had more experience, time, or money on the show is highly debatable, but the quality of the show, or lack thereof, is precisely why I'm so interested in covering it. There's something fascinating about examining an incomplete story as opposed to breaking down a fundamentally bad one, because it's fun to imagine what could have been in a product that had potential. And that's exactly why I keep coming back to this show, despite how much I bash it. As much as it sucks, it has potential. With that in mind, I'd like to pose this question once again to any fans of this show who are still watching. What initially drew you to this show? Between my Promise review and my One Good Thing project, I'm hoping that I've garnered enough good faith in the community, because I was sincere when I said I was curious to know why people like it so much. I'm Officer Happy, and with this review, I've covered every single episode in Season 1 that I wanted to cover, which makes me think that it's a good time to give the show a break and broaden my horizons a bit. I don't know. What do you think I should do, Ancestor?
Continue the onslaught. Destroy them all.
Okay,